Great to see everybody this morning. Have a good number, and we're thankful for your presence, although we have some that are not with us this morning because of illness and various things. But we're truly grateful for your being here, and we're thankful for the encouragement that we give each other as we meet from time to time, study from the Word of the Lord. The lesson that I want to talk about this morning is one that is from the book of Daniel. As was mentioned a moment ago, and I appreciate the reading by Tim. That was not an easy reading, and so I appreciate his tackling that. Thanks to Ray for the great job that he's done on the song service. But we're going to look at the book of Daniel this morning, and we've entitled it Weighed and Found Wanting. Get that from the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel, and at verse 27, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Whenever the idea of a balance here is the picture that I have, it's an old type of a weight that you would put a weight on one side, and then your product or whatever it was that you were trying to measure on the other side. And they should come up and balance out. And in this particular case, he's not talking about material things, but rather he's talking about spiritual things as he addresses the various individuals throughout the pages of the book of Daniel. Might want to mention this morning that Daniel is written during a period when there were supernatural events that would take place. We don't have that in our world today, but throughout the Bible we have from various times that there were supernatural events. For instance, whenever the Lord delivered the people from Egyptian bondage or slavery, that was a time of supernatural events. There are other times that we find throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, of course. There were many supernatural events that took place during that period of time, and even up until the apostles passed away, or perhaps shortly even after those, the last apostle passed away. So we want to keep that in mind as we look at the book of Daniel. Many lessons that we can learn, I believe, though, as we look at the book of Daniel, and actually beginning at the very first, as the very first page is opened, we have a great lesson presented to us. And in this particular place, we find Daniel who determines that he is not going to defile himself with that which the king is wanting to feed him. He has become somewhat of a friend to the individual that is looking after him and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so he tells him, you try this. You feed us only what we would tell you to feed, and see whether or not we are any better or worse off as a result of it. And of course, we know that he did prove that it was okay for him to be fed the way he wanted to be, rather than the way that the king and his handlers wanted them to be fed. But there's a good example we have in this chapter, and it's one that we need to look at. Daniel purposed in his heart, Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Now, there's a good lesson here, I believe, for us, and that lesson is that we do not need to wait to decide whether or not we're going to commit sin. But we need to make up our mind beforehand. Matter of fact, we need to make up our mind right now. We should have made up our mind when we first became a Christian, whether or not we were going to live according to what God would have us to do, or whether we're going to live the way the works of the flesh would have us to do. And so there's a great lesson for us there in this first chapter, that we need to purpose in our heart that we're going to serve the Lord. And whenever sin does approach us, as it always will, we need to have made up our mind a long time ago that we're going to withstand against that sin. But also we find in the second chapter, Daniel has King Nebuchadnezzar has his first dream. And ultimately, he asks his soothsayers and the men that were supposed to be able to foretell dreams, he asked them a very strange request. He said, I'm not going to tell you the dream that I had. You're going to have to tell me the dream and then tell me what the interpretation of it is. Well, they couldn't do it. Finally, and so the king said, if you can't do it, I'm going to kill you. And ultimately, Daniel said that I can do this. I have a God who is able to tell dreams and foretell things, and I'll be able to do it. So please do not kill these individuals, but let me go into the king and let me talk to him. And I believe that I can satisfy that which he would have us to do. And what he finds there is this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had was a huge statue or an image of a man. The man had a head of gold, he says, and it has arms and a chest of silver, and a belly and thighs of bronze or brass, and legs and feet of iron, and partially mixed with clay. And he also shows in that vision that at the end of it that there is a stone that is hewn out of a mountain that was not made with hands. And that stone breaks all of these the feet in this statue into pieces. And of course, Daniel begins to tell Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, now here's the interpretation of it. The head is of gold. The head being of gold, and that represents you, King Nebuchadnezzar. He said, after you, there's going to come another kingdom, and that is represented by the silver. And then he said, there will be a third kingdom that is represented by the bronze, and then a fourth kingdom that's different from all of the others. And that fourth kingdom is represented by the iron, and partially of iron, and partially of clay. And he says, during that kingdom, there would be a kingdom that will be established that will never end. Of course, we know that we can look back in time, and we know that what he's talking about here is 4 world empires, the one after the other, and that fourth empire would be the time when Jesus came into the world, and the kingdom of God was established by him at that particular period of time. But then we also see in the 3rd chapter that Nebuchadnezzar gets the idea that he's going to build a golden statue, an image, the Bible says. Now, most of us probably, when we read the 3rd chapter of Daniel, that we would think that it was an image of himself, perhaps, and it could have been, but it doesn't say. And that's an interesting thing. There's a good lesson in this. I remember 2 or 3 years ago, I think I taught Daniel here in our adult class. And I was saying that there's a possibility that it was a human image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And my son Tim took me to task on that, and he said, it doesn't really say that it was. It just says that it was an image, and he's right. So we don't know for sure what the image was, whether it was him or whether it was something else. Some people say that it may have been an image something like this, that is an obelisk. And they get that from the size that he talks about this image. This image was 90 feet tall and only 9 feet at its base. And it's interesting that the obelisks that have been found, and even I show the picture here of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. These monuments, all of them have a 10-to-1 ratio. And so it may have been that it was some type of an obelisk. There have been a lot of obelisks found in Babylon, in ancient Babylon, and they all pretty well meet the criteria here of this 10-to-1 ratio. So it's very possible that he may have made a image. This one that you see on the left here shows an image of a person on the top of it. And it may have been that it's something like that, or it may have just been something plain. An obelisk would have represented something. But we don't know. It just says a gold image. And as a result of that, there went out a decree that everyone who heard music playing, whenever they heard this certain type of music playing, they would bow down and worship the image that had been made. And as a result of that, the three people that I mentioned a moment ago, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would not do that. And someone found out about it, and they went and told the king. The king brought them in and said, now, I've been told this, and if you'll bow down and worship whenever the music is played, everything will be fine. But if you don't, I'm going to have to throw you in the furnace. Well, the fact is that they were unwilling to do that. They were nice about it, but they said, we're not allowed to worship anything else, and our God will not allow it, and we would prefer to obey God than men. And so they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar got so upset about it, he said, make that furnace 7 times hotter than it normally would be. And that's what he did. Matter of fact, it was so hot that whenever these 3 men were thrown into the furnace, the ones who threw them into the furnace ultimately were burned up themselves. And so they went in there, and for a period of time, we're not told how long, but if you looked in there, you would see that there were not only 3 people that were in there that were not bothered by the fire at all, but there was a 4th one, and it said, it looks like the Son of God. And so they came out, and as a result of that, their obedience to God rather than to man, Nebuchadnezzar identified with the God of heaven. He just added the God of heaven to his other deities that he worshiped at that time. So we have a great example there of keeping one's faith even in the midst of great danger. And then in the 4th chapter, we have the second vision of the book of Daniel. This time Nebuchadnezzar, again, he called the magicians together, and they couldn't answer or give the reason for an interpretation of it. But Daniel comes in and he tells them about this big tree that he had seen. He said he had seen a tree so large that it covered the whole world, the whole earth. And underneath of it were the various animals and people. And within the tree were the birds. So there was protection by this tree that was given there. And Daniel says that tree represented the Nebuchadnezzar, that he was so powerful that he held sway over all the world. But he shows also in this dream that he had that the tree was cut down. But the tree, after it had been cut down, had 2 bands. One was an iron band, and the other was a copper band or a bronze band. And Daniel says that this represents the fact that he would be restored, his kingdom would be restored to him after a period that is referred to as 7 times. We don't know really what that 7 times means, so we're not told, but some have suggested, and probably a good possible reason for it, that it means 7 years, that for 7 years Nebuchadnezzar was out in the field and acted as an animal, a cow, and would eat from the grass and would spend his time out there for this 7-year period. And then once he overcame that period of time, then he would have his kingdom restored to him. The reason for that kingdom being taken away from him was because of his pride. He was proud, and he believed that he had done this all on himself, to himself, and that God, the God of heaven, did not have anything to do with it. So these are some of the things that we look at, and we can see that as we come to chapter 5 of the book of Daniel is where we want to spend the remainder of our time this morning. And this is where we see the handwriting that is on the wall, and just a hand that is out there and is writing these strange sounding words that we were very strange to us. And ultimately Daniel will come at this time once again. and he will interpret these. So as we look at these various examples in the pages of the book of Daniel, I think the thing that the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11 says, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Now, he was talking here about the examples that were given to the Israelites while they were in the wilderness. But the same thing would apply to the examples that we see here of Daniel. And he said, they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. That's talking about you and me. Talking about Paul and the people during his time as well. And so the fact that they have been written for our admonition, we need to take advantage of that. So I want to look at the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel a little bit more closely for the remainder of our time. First of all, we see, beginning at the very first, a drunken feast that is being held in the king's court. In Daniel chapter 5 and at verse 1 beginning, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Now, that sets the stage for us here, I believe, as we begin in our study of this particular chapter in the book of Daniel. And then he continues, and then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So there's what they were doing. Belshazzar gets the party going, as it were, and apparently they had started drinking a lot, and he was feeling good and proud of himself, and suddenly he had the idea, let's go get these implements that had belonged to the Jewish God. Bring them in here, and we're going to commit sacrilege. We're going to drink from them. We're going to eat from them. And we're going to prove that we are superior in every way to this God that they worshiped at that particular time. Now, as we look at this, just real quickly, I want to give a little bit of detail here. This happened about 539 BC. And King Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by a son, a man by the name of Evil Merodach. We find him mentioned in 2 Kings, the 25th chapter, and in verse 27. And then after 2 years, Evil Merodach was assassinated by Neriglissar, his brother-in-law. And then Neriglissar died 4 years later. This would be 556 BC. Leaving the throne to his son, Labashi-Merodach. And then Labashi-Merodach was soon deposed by a priestly revolution. And then Nabonidus, who was a former priest under Nebuchadnezzar, was made king in 556 BC. Nabonidus was more interested in scholarly and religious pursuits, and he appointed his son Belshazzar as ruler of Babylon in his place. So that's how Belshazzar comes upon the scene, and what we've just read just a few moments ago. It's an interesting thing that Belshazzar became co-regent to his father in 550 BC, and thus he was second in command. And this answers the reason why he promised that he would be the third ruler, or that Daniel would be the third ruler in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 16 and verse 29. He said, "You shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So it would have been Nabonidus and then Belshazzar, and then, of course, Daniel had that ultimately taken place. Now look again in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 22, or verse 2. And actually, there are 5 places in this passage that it refers to Belshazzar as being the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And this is one of them in verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels with his father Nebuchadnezzar, and taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So the only reason I mention this is because there's a controversy here as to the fact that Belshazzar really was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But in the way of Jewish presenting things, if you were in the line of a particular king, that king would be referred to as your son or as your father, whichever way that might apply. And so that's why we find that mentioned 5 different times, that Nebuchadnezzar was his father and that he was Nebuchadnezzar's son. But he really wasn't. He was in that line or that lineage. And we find that the problem that we have here in this passage is that they praised the gods of gold and silver. Look at verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Now you stop to think about that for just a moment, that would we really stoop to such a thing as that? Would we actually be willing to praise the gods of gold and silver and those kinds of things? Well, we would probably all say, no, not at all. But the fact is, the Bible teaches us about covetousness. And if we are a covetous person, we're doing the very same thing. For this you know that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Now that's a serious matter. Whenever we covet money, when we covet things, we ultimately are going to have to answer for that. We find in Colossians 3 and verse 5, the Apostle Paul there said the same thing. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So certainly covetousness is a very serious matter. We're reminded of the words of Jesus, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. So we look at this passage in Daniel, and we are reminded of that very fact, that it is important for us not to worship the deity of gold and silver. But also we find that there is a period of panic and humiliation in the king's court on this occasion. In Daniel 5 and verse 5, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the walls of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now here's an interesting thing here. You know that picture that I showed a while ago? It showed the entire hand of a man. I don't know whether that was a thing or not, but what is emphasized here is the fingers of the man's hand appeared. And says that it wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall. Now, there were 1,000 people here at this banquet, and obviously all of them could have not have been close enough to really see exactly what was going on, but he wrote on the wall, and I'm sure it was a pretty significant size in that which he wrote. And but this had a profound effect upon the king, King Belshazzar. Look at in verse 6. This is what we might refer to as the quaking king. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosed, and his knees knocked against each other. Have you ever been afraid enough to have your knees knocked? I don't think I ever have. Perhaps some of you had. But this was a serious thing insofar as this man was concerned. I would say that he sobered up real quick when he saw that hand. He was so proud. And on one minute he was boastful and proud, and the next minute he was shaking in his boots, as we say. And so there's a lesson there for us that we need to recognize that God deals with those that are proud. Matter of fact, this is a good illustration of what the writer of Proverbs says in chapter 16 and verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I don't know about you, but every time I get to thinking I'm too big for my pants, I get a comeuppance real quick. And I'm sure that most of us have experienced that in our lifetime. So we need to work hard against the idea of being proud or having pride in our lives. In the first Psalm, in verse 5, the writer there says, "Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous." Now here he saw just a hand. What if he had seen the whole image of God? What in the world would that have done to him? And the question that we need to ask ourselves, are we going to be able to stand in the judgment? Are we going to be able to stand in the presence of God whenever we come to the end of this life? In Psalm 24, the writer there asks the rhetorical question, who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive blessings from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. So we need to recognize that we're going to have to give an accounting as we go through this life. And it is only those who are right in the sight of God who will ultimately stand in his presence. But then also we find another thing, an interesting fact in this example that we're looking at here in chapter 5. Has to do with the people that he went to find help from. The king cried out, in chapter 5 and verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring to the astrologers, bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now it's interesting that he went to these people. And you know, that's the problem that many people in the world today have. They get into trouble and they start looking in the wrong place for help. We can do that. This man, Belshazzar, looked for those individuals that basically had no power at all to deliver that which he wanted. And we find that sometimes we look in our own strength, to our own strength, for the help that we need. Sometimes we look to other people that really cannot help us, but we think they can. Even some people look to astrology, as some of these individuals were definitely astrologers that we're reading about here. You know, there's that saying, people, in the younger people at least, meet another person and say, what's your sign? And that seems to be popular, or at least it did seem to be popular a few years ago. We're looking in the wrong place many times, and certainly that becomes a problem for us. So that's a good example for us. In verse 8 of this Daniel 5, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. So it made a difference. They brought these people in, but they could not help him. They could not do what he wanted them to do. And in Proverbs 5, where we read the words there of the writer, he says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. But do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be healthy to your flesh and strengthen to your bones." So the person that we need to look to is to God whenever we're in times of difficulty. And certainly we see that in our world today especially. We look out and we see all the things that are going wrong in our government, and people seem to be going every direction except the way that God would have them to go. We're reminded of the words of Jesus: "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." So then we have, finally, we have the arrival of God's man. And in order for him to have come, Belshazzar had to get advice from a queen. In verse 10 it says, of chapter 5, "The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Now this queen that is being talked about here probably is what would be referred to as the queen mother. It would have been his mother, probably, because his wives were already there. We find in Daniel 5 and verse 2, talks about the kings and his lords, his wives, his concubines, that they might drink from them. That is, those emblems. So they were already there, and the queen was not there, or his mother was not there on this occasion. So there's a good example, a lesson for young people today. Listen to what your mother has to say to you. A mother that is directed by the righteousness of God's word needs to be listened to. And young people need to do that. In many families, that just is not the case. But that's a good example for us too, a good lesson for us today. But you notice that the queen was not present in this at this feast at the very beginning. It could be that she recognized that that was not a good place for her to be. And the only reason she went was because that Belshazzar needed her help on this occasion. But then we find that Daniel, before the offended here, or that is before the offender, and that is before Belshazzar. Now Daniel would probably at this time be an old man. He would be at least in his mid-70s and perhaps up to as much as 80 years old. He began as a teenager whenever they were delivered from Jerusalem and taken into Babylonian captivity. So he would possibly be as much as 80 years old at this time. And notice what we find here in this these verses, verses 13 through 16. He asked the question, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you," he says, "and the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. And then you notice he goes on and says, now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. Now, and I have heard of you. It's twice that he said that I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So, seems like Belshazzar had the idea of having heard of him, but he did not really know very much about him. He had heard a few different stories about him, but he really had not bothered to investigate, and apparently he did not know him at this particular time. So that which seems rather strange to me, that a man of Daniel's talent would not have been approached by the king, but he was not. And so we find that when Daniel comes in, he first of all things he does is he rejects the king's reward. He said, you give your reward to another, yet I will read the writing to the king. So here Daniel was not interested in his money, but he was interested in telling him what God had told him. And he goes on in verse 18 of chapter 5, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. I'll not read all the rest of that, but he gives him a history lesson. And he tells him that the pride that Nebuchadnezzar had cost him dearly, as he, at a certain portion in his life, he lost his kingdom. And then he talks about it directly. Now you listen to this and see how serious that would be for you if you were to go into a person of great authority and you were to say something like this. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of this house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drank wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owes all your ways, you have not glorified. Now that had to cut it to the very depth. And as a result of that, he rebukes him. He shows him why he is going to have to give an answer to it. And then he says, the fingers of this hand you sent from him, and this writing was written. And then he tells him about what it means. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Meaning, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Peres, or a part of different phrase for upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. As a result of the interpretation of this dream, it actually came to pass that very night. We find in that Daniel, of course, did not get anything because there was nothing there for him to give after this night was completed. And it says in verse 30 of chapter 5, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So we have the ultimate judgment of God against a man who allowed pride to rule and control him rather than following after that which God would have him to do. So as we close our lesson this morning, I hope that you've gotten something out of these various chapters that we've been looking at. It's a beautiful book and one that we all need to pay close attention to, especially to the prophecies that we find therein. And perhaps there's one here this morning who's not a Christian. You need to recognize that you're someday going to stand before God, give an account of those things that you've done, whether they be good or whether they be bad. The Bible is real simple. It's very clear. It teaches that we must believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. We must be willing to repent of our sins. We must be willing to confess Jesus as Lord before men, and then be buried in baptism with him for the forgiveness of those sins. If you haven't done that, you need to do it this morning. If you're a child of God and there's something amiss in your life, we would encourage you to make that right, whatever it might be, as we stand and as we sing. Won't you please come?